Good morning. This is the first lecture in my course, The Era of the Civil War, History 459 here at George Fox University. Today's lecture is entitled The Age of Jackson. Andrew Jackson is one of the most important presidents in American history. And so in today's lecture, I will lay out some of the most important aspects of Jackson's presidency and the principles that he believed in and tried to execute, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully, as President of the United States. The PowerPoint you're looking at right now is a quote from Major General Fox Connor. And Connor was Chief of Staff of the American Expeditionary Force during the First World War. And then in the 1920s, he was a mentor to a young Army officer by the name of Dwight Eisenhower. And Connor was an intellectual, an Army intellectual, and might have been a very successful college professor had he chosen that career path. But he explains in this quote how mankind at least ought to be able to differentiate through the course of analysis between events and perhaps plot a more wise and hopefully peaceful course. So Connor is explaining why human beings study history. And obviously the great effort here is to avoid making the mistakes that human beings have made in the past. Well, let's move on from Connor to the age of Andrew Jackson. It is Inauguration Day, March of 1829. Jackson was elected president the previous November of 1828. It is surprisingly warm after an icy winter. For days, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, has been filling up with Americans, Jackson's people. People came from hundreds of miles around to see their man, Andrew Jackson, become president of the United States. And the soon-to-be president strode to the podium for his inaugural address, decked out in black, out of respect for his late wife, Rachel. Beset by a cough, he delivered his address in a low voice, and only those people who were very near the podium could hear what he said. It was just as well, for the new president said little of substance so as to avoid giving offense on his first day in office. He vaguely referred to the issues the country faced at that time and which would define his administration: the tariff, the idea of nullification, of nullifying, disobeying, frankly, a federal law, the Bank of the United States, and then internal improvements. These were the issues that would dominate Jackson's 8 years as president. Nevertheless, even though he said little about these issues, Francis Scott Key, the author of the national anthem, Francis Scott Key witnessed the event and he said, "It is beautiful. It is sublime." The frame of reference, of course, was that Jackson represented the American people. Jackson was not a member of the American elite. And all previous presidents were thought to represent that elite stratus of American society. Jackson was not one of them. After the inauguration, the people pressed into the White House in a great mob. They stood on furniture. They broke dishes, and in general, they wreaked havoc in the White House. They all were seeking a glimpse of the great man, and they all wanted to shake his hand. Jackson, for his part, escaped through a side door, and he retired to his boarding house. He had yet to move into the White House. And he ate a quiet meal in the evening. The meaning of Jackson's election. Francis Scott Key understood that something new was happening. For Jackson's election initiated a new era in American politics. He was the first president who did not come from one of those elite colonial families. Rather, he was from the frontier. He was a self-made soldier, a self-made politician. He had risen from the ranks. He was the symbol of the American rugged individualist. Many of the American people now saw themselves in the White House. One of their own was president of the United States. Jackson was born in a log cabin, not in a colonial mansion. So what was the essence of Jacksonian democracy? And this is an important phrase. Jacksonian democracy is different from the democracy of the founding fathers. Something new in America is taking place. Frankly, something that the founding fathers would not have been in favor of. If Jackson was different, what were the principles that made him so? Jackson, you see, sought to democratize economic opportunity and to increase democratic political participation. So a key word for Jackson and for this era is democracy. As Jackson frequently declared, the great body of the people in his system, in his iteration of democracy, the great body of the people would genuinely rule the country. And Jackson, not surprisingly, saw himself as the embodiment of the people. You see, the founding fathers did not think that the people themselves should rule. They thought, yes, most Americans could vote, but the founding fathers believed that the vast majority of Americans would vote for the highly educated, the highly accomplished, the Washingtons and the Adams and the Jeffersons, the Hamiltons, frankly, of the founding fathers era, and that this is the way the country would operate. But Jackson is not one of these people. Again, Jackson is from the frontier. He doesn't have the education. He did not have the social standing of the founding fathers' elites. Jackson is an average American. And Jackson wanted every American to have an equal chance to compete in the economic marketplace, to participate in democracy. One Jacksonian described it this way: true republicanism requires that every man shall have an equal opportunity to become as unequal as he can. In short, the Jacksonians believed in equality of opportunity, but they do not believe in equality of outcome. Again, the Jacksonians believe in that every man should have a roughly equal opportunity to succeed, but they do not believe in equality of outcome, of results. This belief is now a core element of the American character. Most Americans would agree that everybody ought to have a fair chance at success. But that concept is under attack today from those who would emphasize equality of outcome, and especially equality of outcome through government action or government programs or or through various federal laws. Obviously, there is a contradiction in this ideal, even amongst the Jacksonians, since true, absolute equality of opportunity cannot occur if some Americans start the contest with more resources, the results of the inequality of outcome from previous generations. So Jacksonians are not imagining a perfectly equal opportunity, but a roughly equal opportunity, a fair chance. And especially what the Jacksonians meant was that the government, the federal government, would not favor one man over another. And the Jacksonians believed that under the founding fathers, that is exactly what had happened, that the federal government favored one kind of American over another kind of American. The Jacksonians believed that the tariff initiated in George Washington's first term and the Bank of the United States that came along a little bit later favored the elites, the upper classes. And the Jacksonian wanted those governmental favors removed so that every American would have a roughly equal opportunity at economic success. So the Jacksonians were the opposite of today's Democrats. And I don't mean this in a critical way, I simply want you to understand. They're the opposite of today's Democrats in terms of government action. The Jacksonians, the Democratic Party, and this is the Democratic Party of today, it traces its roots all the way back to Andrew Jackson. The Democrats of Jackson's time wanted less federal action, less government, if you will. Today's Democrats clearly favor generally more government programs and higher taxes and so forth. The similarity in the two eras of the Democratic Party is that at both times, the Democrats are interested in helping the common people. How you do that is the difference. Which brings us to Andrew Jackson and internal improvements, that is, projects paid for by government that would improve the United States. The president, Andrew Jackson now, was opposed to federal aid for local projects. That is, a project that would be built or done entirely within a single state. At stake here is the constitutional principle of state versus federal authority. Another way to express it is to ask the question, should citizens in one state have to pay for projects that do not directly benefit them? Imagine a road in New York State, and since it's a federal project, should the people of Virginia have to help pay for the road in New York State? So in this early time in our republic, we are addressing this kind of question and trying to find a principle or an answer to that question. In 1830, Congress passed the so-called Maysville Road Bill. And the Maysville Road Bill authorized money for road construction in Kentucky. Jackson now vetoed the bill. And in doing this, he took a swipe at Henry Clay and the opposition party, at that time now known as the Whig Party. And this Whig Party had a more federalist view of the Constitution. That is, they believed, like the Federalists before them of George Washington's time, Alexander Hamilton, etc., that the federal government had and should have more power to do various things. Whereas the Democrats now, under Jackson, as I've already explained, believed in restricted federal power. And so Jackson now vetoes the Maysville Road Bill. And the president's action set a precedent that would last a generation. And he established a theory of federal government restraint that would remain a force in America into the 1930s, the New Deal of the 1930s, which was clearly an explosion of federal programs and federal powers. Indeed, though we no longer frame the debate in these terms, the issue of states' rights versus federal authority is still one of the great points of conflict to this day. Which brings us to the nullification controversy. But before I go on to the nullification controversy, let me just summarize. So Jackson vetoes the Maysville Road bill because the Maysville Road was going to be built entirely inside the state of Kentucky. His point of view would be, let the people of Kentucky pay for it, let the people of Kentucky build it, and let the rest of the states go on and take care of their own selves. But the federal government should not be in the business of building projects inside a particular state. Now, if a project crossed state lines, was national in scope, that's a different issue. Well, the nullification controversy was engendered by disagreement over the tariff. But everyone was aware that the principle at stake in the nullification/tariff controversy had to do with the nature of the union itself and potentially with what was called euphemistically the peculiar institution. The peculiar institution is a way of referencing slavery without saying slavery itself. Similar to the internal improvements disagreement, the nullification controversy centers again on state versus federal power. So here is a theme of the era and a theme of the lecture, state versus federal power. South Carolina at this time suffered from an agricultural depression. And since South Carolina was an agricultural state, this state is in the midst of a depression. In the 1820s, almost 70,000 people, a large percentage of the population, left the state of South Carolina. And most South Carolinians blamed the federal tariff for their distress. It was the tariff that was causing this financial difficulty in agriculture. The tariff, of course, raised the price of manufactured goods. It raised the price of manufactured goods in the United States, and it made it more difficult to sell cotton abroad. Now, at this point, I'm going to explain the ins and outs and how tariffs work. I'm going to do it this one time. Hopefully you already know this, but if you don't, pay attention, because the tariff is crucial at this time and in the rest of American history, and the tariff policy in the United States in the year 2020 is front and center in our national politics. So a tariff is another way of saying a tax. It's a tax on imported goods. So let's use an example, goods coming in from Great Britain. Let's use the example of shoes that are manufactured in Great Britain and sent to the United States. So these are foreign goods and they are imported into the United States. When those shoes or any other product get to the port, let's say Boston or Charleston, there is a customs agent there, a tariff agent, who says, okay, you've got so many tons of this and so many tons of that, so there's a tariff, a tax on that imported item. And so the importer has to pay that tariff. The money then goes to the federal government. That's how the tariff provides revenue for the federal government. And then what the importer does as he turns around then to sell the shoes is he raises the price of those shoes a little bit to cover the cost of the tariff. Now, an American manufacturer of shoes does not have to pay a tariff. He's not importing his shoes. He's making them right here in the United States. So he loves the tariff because now his imported competitors' shoes cost more. So he can either undersell the imported shoes or he can even raise the price of his shoes a little bit and make a little bit more money. And in a perfect world, he might even pay his employees a little bit more because he's making a little bit more on his shoes. So a tariff does two things. It raises revenue for the federal government. That's where the tariff money goes. But it also protects, key word, it protects the internal or domestic industry, you see. It allows an American manufacturer to not have to worry so much about foreign competition and perhaps make a little bit more money. So northern manufacturers, and that's where most of the industry was in the country at this time, love the tariff. Southerners don't have much industry. They are an exporting region of the country. They are trying to export their agricultural products out of the country. And the way tariffs work is that, so a nation then, let's say Great Britain again, sending goods to the United States, they know that they have to pay a tariff. That generally means that they're going to sell less goods because the prices are higher in the United States. And so sometimes a nation then will put up a tariff of their own against goods coming from, let's say, the United States in this instance. That means our goods going to Great Britain are going to cost more over there, and we're not going to sell as many as we might have had there been no tariff, you see. Southerners are exporters. They're trying to sell as much cotton and rice and tobacco as they possibly can, but because we do have a tariff in this country, in the United States, other nations then establish tariffs against us, and that generally hurts Southerners. Southerners then do not like the tariff very much. They want the American tariffs to be lowered in the hopes then that other nations will lower their tariffs, and then Southerners will be able to sell more goods. Tariffs still work this in the same way today, and they're still controversial for the same reasons today. Generally today, though, we emphasize the fact that an American tariff will protect not so much the profits of American business people, but the jobs of American workers, and that is true. If Americans cannot compete with overseas goods because they're too cheap, China, then Americans will lose their jobs, you see, lose their factories, lose their jobs. And that's more the issue today. So that's how the tariff works, and that's why a tariff was controversial back at that time. So again, you absolutely have to master the intricacies of the tariff in order to understand American history, even at a rudimentary level. And since many, perhaps most of you hope to teach American history someday, obviously you have to master the intricacies of a tariff. Well, the tariff of 1828, called the Tariff of Abominations by Southerners, raised several important tariff rates. But South Carolinians had hope. John Calhoun was elected Jackson's vice president. Surely, relief from the tariff would be forthcoming if South Carolina and other southern states had one of theirs as vice president of the United States. South Carolinians were so angry at the exorbitantly high tariff of 1828 that Calhoun wrote a reasoned pamphlet which postulated now the theory of nullification. According to Calhoun's theory, if a state believed that a federal law was unconstitutional, this is the key point now, the state has to believe the federal law is unconstitutional. It has the right to call a state convention, not the state legislature, but a separate convention. And this, by the way, was the same process by which the states ratified the Constitution back in the late 1780s. They called special ratification conventions at that time. Well, if a state believed that a federal law was unconstitutional, they could call a state convention to discuss whether or not they would declare that law unconstitutional. And then, if so approved, they would not obey the federal law. This is the theory of nullification, to nullify, to annul, as if it didn't happen. That's where the word annulment of a marriage comes from, as if it did not happen. The constitutional question here concerning the tariff was that South Carolinians argued that in the Constitution says tariffs are okay, but only to raise revenue for the federal government. The higher a tariff goes, it cuts off trade, and actually the less revenue it actually brings in because there's no trade. And so the South Carolinians are arguing that the tariff is so high that it's reduced trade to a trickle. And what the tariff is really doing is just protecting the American domestic industry from foreign competition. Therefore, it is not raising any revenue. It is unconstitutional. Well, the Jackson administration does not move very quickly on the tariff issue. And so the South Carolinians and other Southerners are frustrated over this. Its patience at an end in 1832, South Carolina called one of those special conventions, and it passed the ordinance of nullification. South Carolina now is claiming the authority to nullify or annul a federal law on constitutional grounds. The South Carolina legislature now elected Calhoun, a U.S. senator. So he resigns his position as vice president. He's now going to represent South Carolina in the United States Senate so he can defend and explain the nullification law that South Carolina has just passed. If the South Carolina nullification law were allowed to stand, the federal government would be a facade. Any state at any time could call a constitutional convention and declare a federal law null and void. And so again, the federal government would be a joke. In addition, you could see now that southern states could use the nullification law, the nullification principle precedent, to defend slavery. If the federal government tried to pass a law or even a constitutional amendment to end slavery, nullification. Don't obey it. And so this is a crucial test of the power of the Constitution and the federal government. Well, Andrew Jackson had no intention of allowing nullification to establish itself as a cancer in the Union. It would have definitely killed the Union had it been allowed to exist. Fortunately, his task was made incomparably easier because no other state was willing to take this risk and stand with South Carolina in flaunting federal authority. Yeah, there were other people in other states that were sympathetic, but no state stood with the South Carolinians. On December 10th, 1832, Jackson delivered a nullification proclamation. He said, and I quote now, "I consider then the power to annul a law in the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle upon which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed, that is, to create the Union." It's going to destroy the Union. And then he made his intent explicit. He said in an emotional passage, "The laws of the United States," the tariff, "must be executed. I have no discretionary power on the subject. My duty is emphatically pronounced in the Constitution. Those who told you," that's Calhoun, "that you might peaceably prevent their execution," that is the execution of the laws of the United States, the tariff, "they deceived you. They could not have been deceived themselves. Their object is disunion. But be not deceived by names. Disunion by force is armed treason." Privately, and this is Jackson, volatile. He threatened to hang Calhoun from a sour apple tree. This was his former vice president. Jackson now backed up his words with force. He sent General Winfield Scott with Army reinforcements to Charleston Harbor, Charleston, South Carolina. And he sent ships into the harbor, one of the great harbors on the East Coast, to Charleston, South Carolina, to go from ship to ship to enforce the tariff, to collect the tariff, if necessary. Now, in order to gain the support of the rest of the country, to get everybody on paper as to where they stand, he asked for a force bill to be passed in Congress, which would give him the authority to use force. He already had this authority. There's no question about this. He has this authority to enforce the laws of the United States. But the force bill, again, was an effort to align all of the parties behind the Union. Again, you are now going to have to vote, and the people are going to see where you stand. At the same time, and this is crucial now, Jackson, who himself thought the tariff was too high, moved behind the scenes in Congress to pass legislation that would gradually reduce the tariff. In March of 1833, Congress, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky, and Clay's nickname is the Great Compromiser. Boy, does the United States need a Henry Clay today, because today the word compromise has become a four-letter word. But in the final analysis, our constitutional Republican form of government depends upon compromise. And so Clay managed to get both the force bill passed and the new lower tariff passed. South Carolina, now seeing that they had accomplished their goal, a lower tariff, rescinded the nullification ordinance. On the other hand, Jackson also had clearly upheld the authority of the Union, and he had demonstrated that he was reasonable. South Carolina won a reduction in the tariff. The tariff on cotton, for an example, was reduced by 50% over the next 10 years. It gradually goes down. This is going to make it possible for Southerners to sell more cotton abroad, all other things being equal. But the issue is not over. Calhoun was prophetic. The struggle, and this is John Calhoun you're seeing, the struggle, so far from being over, is not even more than fairly commenced. We're just beginning to fight over this states' rights versus federal power. Jackson, for his part, lamented that he had missed the opportunity to hang Calhoun. The nullification controversy tested the durability of the Union, the power of the presidency, the character of the president. All these things were at stake. Moreover, everyone knew that the tariff issue, emotional as it was, and it was very serious, was but a pinprick compared to the bloodletting that the slavery issue might cause. The bank controversy, the bank war. Jackson's war on the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States, created during the first administration of George Washington, and then reformed and reiterated later on during Monroe's presidency, was a very popular institution, but also a very hated institution. In other words, a very controversial institution. Jackson's war on the Bank of the United States increased his popularity amongst the common people, the people that had largely elected him. especially amongst the farmers. Jackson and the common people had long held a mistrust of banks. In those days, there was no insurance for banks. If the man or the person or the board that ran a bank took too many risks and were unlucky and they lost the money that had been put in that bank, then if you had an investment in a bank that was managed in this way, you lost your money. So there's no insurance, there's no guarantee. The only guarantee you had was the strength and wisdom of the bankers that ran your bank. Well, banks were forever, it seemed, going bankrupt, and the common people who put their money in savings accounts and so forth were constantly losing their money. In some cases, their entire life savings. So a poor farmer or a poor worker could easily be ruined because those who ran the banks, again, were either foolish or unlucky. Ironically, the Bank of the United States, which was effectively a central federal bank, helped minimize such problems. It served as a source of loans for private banks and a source of stability for those banks. Again, irony. But much of this is lost on the American people. Moreover, if a private bank wanted to borrow money from the Bank of the United States, in order to get that money, it had to have a certain amount of its own reserve capital on hand. That is, it couldn't lend that capital out to other businesses and so forth. And it's always the lending of too much capital to businesses that are too risky that will lead to the failure of a bank. So the Bank of the United States, the bus, served to restrict speculation to a certain extent, a good thing for the financial structure of the United States. So why then does Jackson target the Bank of the United States? Why were the common people angry at the Bank of the United States? Ignorance and fear of complex things, that's part of it. But the main reason is that the Bank of the United States now was partially owned by private individuals. And it took a lot of capital to invest in the Bank of the United States, to buy shares in the bank. So these were wealthy individuals. Now, the government owns part of the bank, but again, it's a partnership with wealthy individuals. So because it's the common people versus the wealthy, the Bank of the United States is seen as a target. And many people believe that because the wealthy had their hands literally in the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States was running the financial affairs of the country in the interests of who? The wealthy. So this is a class conflict issue. It always seemed that the average man, too, was being foreclosed on by some bank. Since it was not conceivable at this point that private banks could be eliminated, the target for the antipathy, the anger of the American people, that is, many of the American people, became the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the Wealthy. Now in 1832, the supporters of the Bank of the United States, those people like Hamilton who had believed in it, they decided that now was a good time to coerce Jackson into extending the charter of the Bank of the United States. In other words, extending the life of the bank. In 1832, an election year, the bank supporters believed the president would either have to sign the bill, thus damaging his support amongst the very people that had elected him. And this is a very political thing. They want to get rid of Jackson. They don't like him. Or he would veto the bill, which would also make him unpopular amongst many people who did like the Bank of the United States, but who had also voted for Jackson. So for the supporters of the bank, it's a win-win. If he vetoes the bill, many Americans who did actually like Jackson will be angry at him. And if he doesn't, his own natural supporters, farmers and workers and so forth, will be angry at him. Jackson took up the challenge. He vetoed the bill in July of 1832, and he carried his message to the people. Jackson's opponents, among them Daniel Webster, accused him of trying to stir up the poor against the rich. But the election of 1832, again a presidential year, vindicated Old Hickory, that's his nickname. He defeated Henry Clay in the presidential election. Clay was nominated by the very short-lived National Republican Party, not the Republican Party of today, different party. But Jackson is reelected in 1832. And the charter of the Bank of the United States expired in 1836 because Jackson would not renew it. So the bank died in 1836. You now have no central banking system in the United States, and the United States will not have a central banking system until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson, in one of his great reforms, created the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System that is still with us 107 years later. So if it helps, you can think of the Bank of the United States as a form of the Federal Reserve System that we have today, a precursor of that. But now Andrew Jackson has killed the Bank of the United States in 1836. Unfortunately, Jackson's dismantling of the Bank of the United States brought on a financial panic, just as many people warned it would. And so the panic/recession, depression of 1837 results, and this lasts for years. In fact, one of the reasons that Americans went west in the 1840s over the Oregon Trail was to get out of the economic chaos and collapse of the late 1830s, early 1840s. One of the reasons. Not the only. Summary. In summary, Jackson's economic policies had a mixed impact on people they were intended to help. And again, the depression that followed the killing of the bank hurt many farmers and workers. The gradual reduction of tariffs, of course, made goods less expensive in the country, just as it was intended to do. And it did help expand trade. Americans were able to sell more goods overseas because our tariffs were low. But the attack on the Bank of the United States destabilized the financial system and ruined many people. Jackson's rise to the presidency forever changed the United States. He was the common man made good. He was the symbol of the faith of the American people that opportunity in America was limitless, that it should be limitless. He was also proof that the American people could change the nation, that the government could be made to serve the people, the common man, more effectively. In the Jacksonian era, more white males were voting, and political parties themselves depended upon massive public participation, otherwise known as democracy. We're now firmly ensconced in the American political fabric. So it's in this era that political parties become apparently permanent fixture in our political system. Politicians now came from every walk of life, not just the colonial elite and the early republic elite of previous ages. The Americans had not created a perfect democracy. The Jacksonians had not created perfect equality of opportunity. But in both endeavors, the American people had made unique and earth-shaking advances. And so it was in 1848 that Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French observer and writer, wrote in one of the classic works on democracy, especially democracy in America. He wrote in his preface to that great work, Where else can we, Europeans, find greater cause of hope or more valuable lessons than in the United States, than in Jacksonian America? Well, I thank you for your time, and God bless you all.